The radar scope was blank. No blip, no ping, no trail, just static. Inside a Soviet early warning facility, near Lvov in 1989, a shift supervisor leaned forward over the console, confused. Seconds earlier, a border sensor had triggered a low pulse. Something crossed the invisible line. But now nothing. No aircraft ID, no altitude track, no transponder, just silence. Then the second alert came, this time from a ground unit near Debrecen, hundreds of kilometers south. A faint acoustic signature. High altitude, unknown origin. Pilots scrambled. The alert level surged. But the target, if it existed, was nowhere to be seen. In the war room, the air defense officer stared at the map. He was watching two truths collide. The radar said the sky was clear, but the border station said something had passed. Something real. He radioed command unknown contact, possibly stealth. Negative lock. Silence. The Soviet Union had built the densest radar network in the world. 5 overlapping layers of surveillance, ground-based, airborne, orbital. From the Baltic to the Black Sea, nothing moved unseen, or so they believed. But tonight, something was moving. Unseen, untouchable. Somewhere in the dark, a new American aircraft flew like a shadow across Warsaw Pact territory. No missile lock, no radar trace, no interception, only absence. And when it was gone just like that, it left no trace behind, except fear. That aircraft was the F-117 Nighthawk. Not the fastest, not the highest, not even armed with radar, just invisible. Built not to defeat Soviet air defense, but to deny it the fight entirely. And in that moment, the most advanced air control system ever designed, the pride of Soviet aerospace doctrine, was staring into the void, realizing it had been blind the whole time. For decades, the Soviet Union had obsessed over radar. In their worldview, the sky was a grid, every inch measurable, every target detectable. From the forests of Poland to the mountains of Georgia, they had built the largest, deepest, and most redundant air defense system on Earth. It was not a wall, it was a dome, 5 layers deep, over 2,000 fixed radar stations, thousands more mobile units, radar-equipped aircraft, and infrared sensors. Each system was optimized to detect high-flying U-2s, low-flying bombers, supersonic missiles. They had built it to stop anything they could see. But that was the assumption, that everything could be seen. From the 1950s onward, every doctrine, every investment, every officer's training was built around one central truth. Radar ruled the air. If a target could be tracked, it could be locked. If it could be locked, it could be destroyed. And this belief was not just operational, it was ideological. The Soviet concept of vozdушное пространство, airspace sovereignty, meant total control. Nothing entered Soviet skies without being challenged. Nothing escaped. Radar was not just a sensor. It was a wall of national honor. By the 1980s, they had refined it into a science. With phased array radars like the 5N6 and mobile systems like the 3066, they could detect targets hundreds of kilometers away. In any weather, day or night, the S-200, the S-300, these were the swords, but radar was the shield. That shield had caught the U-2. It had tracked B-52s. It had blinded NATO exercises. It had earned them respect and fear, but it had also made them complacent. They believed in equations, cross-sections, signatures. They believed if they pumped enough energy into the sky, nothing could hide, and they were wrong. In 1989, when the F-117 crossed their detection zones, it didn't jam their radar. It didn't fight. It didn't even announce itself. It simply existed outside the Soviet imagination. And for the first time, The officers inside the Impenetrable system realized what they had built was a beautiful, brilliant, perfectly engineered net for catching fish that no longer swam. The Soviet air defense system was designed like a layered puzzle. Each piece had one job: detect, track, identify, intercept. Long-range surveillance radars watched the borders, medium-range tracking systems guided missile locks. Fighter interceptors like the MiG-25 and MiG-31 waited in hardened shelters, ready to engage within minutes. But the entire structure depended on one critical moment: initial detection. If the radar saw you, you were marked. If it didn't, you didn't exist. For years, this doctrine had seemed unbreakable. The Soviets had refined it through wars, incidents, and decades of arms races. They believed speed could be countered by response, altitude could be neutralized by missile arcs, electronic jamming could be defeated by signal redundancy. Their greatest fear had always been surprise. So they buried that fear beneath layers of logic. They told themselves nothing can fly without being seen. Not by us. And then came a jet shaped like a diamond, built not to pierce their lines, but to bend around them. The F-117 Nighthawk didn't fly fast. It didn't fly high. It didn't carry radar. It didn't even look like an airplane. But every inch of it was engineered to do one thing: evade reflection. Instead of fighting radar, it erased itself from the electromagnetic battlefield. Its fuselage scattered beams like broken glass. Its skin absorbed frequencies across multiple bands. Its engine intakes were buried deep to minimize heat signature. Even its flight paths were designed to slip between known radar fields. The Soviets had prepared for aircraft that challenged their systems, but the F-117 ignored them entirely. In simulations, the Soviet PVO air defense forces had modeled scenarios against fast intrusions, missile swarms, jamming attacks, but no one had imagined a target that never showed up, and because the doctrine couldn't see it, the doctrine couldn't name it. Some officers suspected something new was coming, but they were told there is no aircraft the Americans could build that would fly through our airspace unseen. The manuals didn't mention stealth. The protocols didn't allow for it. The operators weren't trained to respond to absence. And in 1989, when that absence appeared over their screens, doctrine failed before the first missile was ever armed. It happened over Hungary, a night so quiet. Radar operators in Debrecen could hear their own breath. The air was thick with tension. NATO exercises were nearby, but none were scheduled in this corridor. Soviet-aligned radar crews had their screens primed. Their SAM batteries were on alert. MiG pilots were fueled and waiting. Then came the call. A low-frequency ground sensor registered a sonic footprint barely above ambient noise. No aircraft ID, no beacon, just a whisper, like something moving through the dark at subsonic speed. One officer leaned in, possible incursion. Another shook his head, no signal. Could be a bird or a glitch. But the footprint moved. It tracked west to east, low altitude, silent. And it wasn't alone. 5 radar stations confirmed an atmospheric anomaly passing through the surveillance net. Yet no one could see it. No P-18 spoon rest. No 36 D6 tin shield. Not even the long-range P-14 Tall King detected a trace. Still, something was coming. Command ordered a scramble. MiG-23s lifted off. Pilots were instructed to intercept at coordinates based on acoustic triangulation. Nothing. When they scanned the sky, no silhouette, no afterburner glow, no contrail, just static on the radar and an empty sky before dawn. On the ground, a mobile radar crew picked up a faint pulse, highly inconsistent. One tech reported, "It vanished before we got a range." By the time the air defense network triangulated a probable path, the object had already passed, gone, and 24 hours later, something worse arrived. Satellite photos, high-resolution images of Soviet-aligned air bases and missile batteries in Yugoslavia, East Germany, and Romania, published in American military briefings, leaked to press circles in Washington. Angles and elevations that couldn't have come from space. They had been taken from inside by something for Soviet radar officers. The conclusion was devastating. The enemy had flown straight through their airspace, and no one had fired a shot. Not because they missed it, but because they never saw it coming. The first impossible event was not a dogfight. It was a void, a shape that tore through the very fabric of Soviet defense without ever being detected. When the incident report reached the Soviet Ministry of Defense, it triggered confusion, not alarm. High Command had seen anomalies before NATO exercises. Stray commercial flights, radar ghosts. But this was something different. No radar hit, no transponder, no intercept. And yet, days later, the Americans had satellite-grade photos from deep within Warsaw Pact territory. The initial reaction was denial. There was no aircraft, said one deputy commander. We would have tracked it, we would have heard it, added another. The conclusion, operator error. They blamed low-skilled technicians in border zones. They blamed weather, ground clutter, perhaps even a spoofing signal from a NATO ECM aircraft. Anything but what the field reports implied, that an unknown object had entered their skies, passed through multiple radar layers, and escaped undetected. An officer from the Air Defense Academy in Zhukovsky reviewed the recordings and issued a damning line. The system worked as designed. That's the problem. But Moscow wouldn't hear it, because to accept the truth meant more than admitting a tactical failure. It meant the architecture of Soviet air superiority, years of doctrine, engineering, and propaganda had been breached. And not by a missile, not by a bomber, but by absence. A plane that didn't jam, didn't dodge, didn't speed. It simply didn't appear. And Moscow's pride couldn't process that. The official position became one of misidentification. No incident occurred, no American aircraft flew through packed airspace, no response necessary. But deep inside the classified war rooms, contingency teams began quietly rewriting assumptions. They combed through grainy reconnaissance from NATO bases in Italy, Turkey, and Germany. They found odd silhouettes, strange hangars, heat patterns that didn't match known aircraft. Someone uttered the phrase stealth fighter and was told never to use it again. But the idea had already taken root. The Americans had something invisible. And while the Kremlin refused to admit it aloud, the radar officers on the front lines already knew. They had felt it, seen it in its absence, and worse, they had watched it leave without ever touching a button. In the aftermath of the undetected overflight, the Soviet Air Defense Command was under pressure to explain the inexplicable. But instead of looking outward, they looked inward and came up with the wrong answer. A new theory emerged. It wasn't a stealth aircraft, it was a glitch in the radar logic. Soviet engineers argued that certain atmospheric conditions, combined with NATO jamming signatures, could create blind spots. They proposed that a sophisticated spoofing system possibly deployed from an RC-135 or a modified AWACS had used Doppler shifts to mimic radar silence. The F-117 a myth, a projection, a distraction. To many senior officers, this made sense. After all, the Americans had been refining electronic warfare since Vietnam. Their EA-6B Prowlers and EF-111 Ravens had sown chaos during previous engagements. It wasn't impossible that a new system could momentarily blind Soviet radar, but this theory missed one crucial fact. There was no jamming, no broadband interference, no signal saturation, no electromagnetic spikes, just silence. The F-117 didn't fight radar. It avoided it, and that subtle distinction made the wrong theory seductive. Because if the Americans had simply jammed Soviet defenses, that meant the system itself still worked. It had just been overpowered. That could be fixed with better shielding, newer software, more powerful frequencies. So they poured resources into counter-electronic warfare. Radar firmware was upgraded. Redundancy bands were added. Operators were trained to spot ghosting patterns and deep field interference. Entire squadrons practiced under heavy simulated jamming scenarios, but none of this would stop a target that never emitted. The F-117 didn't project signals, it absorbed them. And while the Soviet command played chess with shadows, the Nighthawk continued to fly over Lebanon, over Libya, over Panama, over Baghdad, and always undetected. The wrong theory gave the Soviet system a comforting illusion that it hadn't failed. It had simply been tricked. But stealth was not a trick. It was science, geometry, and material engineered into a shape that broke their entire concept of warfare. And as long as Moscow believed in the wrong theory, the right enemy kept flying above them, unseen. If jamming wasn't the answer, then perhaps, Soviet commanders thought, this ghost aircraft wasn't even real. Maybe it was psychological warfare, a strategic illusion designed to destabilize air defense crews, erode confidence, and force the Soviets into defensive overreach. The second wrong theory was born from fear of American manipulation, not technology. They called it vozdushnaya maskirovka, aerial deception. Under this belief, the Americans had planted false sensor echoes, simulated flight paths, and faked border violations with low-power drones or balloons carrying radar reflectors. Maybe the SR-71 had dropped passive radar bouncers. Maybe NATO satellites had triggered false alerts to confuse triangulation software. Maybe they were seeing nothing and reacting to it anyway. It wasn't an aircraft, they claimed. It was a bluff, a signal to make Soviet forces twitch, panic, waste missiles, scramble interceptors unnecessarily draining resources, exposing gaps. This interpretation gained traction among political officers who preferred to see American capability as psychological, not material. After all, if the enemy could convince you they were invisible, that was a weapon in itself. So new protocols were issued. Don't escalate without a confirmed radar return. Don't scramble fighters for acoustic anomalies. Don't report sightings unless verified by two systems. In short, trust the net, not the instinct. But this new discipline did exactly what the Americans wanted. It slowed reaction. It introduced hesitation. It taught Soviet radar officers to question their gut when the enemy's greatest weapon was being invisible to the mind as well as the machine. The second wrong theory buried the truth even deeper. It let the generals sleep. It kept the reports clean. It maintained the illusion that the system still worked. Meanwhile, the F-117 crossed skies without radar detection, delivered strikes without warning, and returned home untouched. It wasn't playing mind games. It was executing strategic missions. But because the Soviet command believed it was a phantom, they never prepared for the reality. And by the time they realized the Nighthawk was real, it had already rewritten the air war. The KGB had failed. The GRU had failed. Even the Soviet Space Reconnaissance Division had failed. Because by the time the F-117 had flown across Warsaw-packed airspace, the United States had already been flying stealth aircraft for nearly 6 years, and the Soviets didn't even know what it looked like. This wasn't just a leak. It was a chasm in intelligence. From as early as 1977, American defense circles had whispered about a classified project under Lockheed's Skunk Works. Soviet agents caught fragments have blue, senior trend, tacit blue. But the words meant nothing without context. Blueprints were never acquired, prototypes never photographed, test ranges never penetrated. For a country that prided itself on penetrating every layer of U.S. military development, this was catastrophic. Even when reconnaissance satellites captured strange angular shapes at Groom Lake, Soviet analysts misclassified them. Some believed it was a drone, others thought it was an experimental radar calibration target. A few suspected it was a decoy too unnatural, too geometrically absurd to fly, because no one imagined an aircraft that would break every rule of flight in order to break radar itself. And when the F-117 entered operational service in 1983, the Soviets missed it. Not once, not twice, but for years. They had no agent embedded inside Skunk Works, no leaks from the Pentagon, no whistleblower, no disgruntled contractor, no intercepted comms. The Americans had built an entire combat-ready fleet, and the Soviets didn't even know the name of the program until after it flew. And when it finally flew through their skies, they didn't detect it. And when they detected something, they didn't believe it, and when they believed it, they misdiagnosed it. The entire intelligence failure wasn't just about the F-117. It was about the Soviet assumption that they knew the limits of American capability. But stealth was not within those limits. It moved the boundaries. It redefined air power. And in doing so, it revealed how brittle Soviet intelligence had become, how reactive, how dependent on predictable doctrines and traceable developments. They had predicted another SR-71, a faster bomber, a higher satellite. They had not prepared for something that flew at subsonic speeds and still couldn't be seen. The F-117 didn't just evade radar, it evaded every net the Soviet system had ever cast. The F-117 wasn't just an airplane, it was a declaration of war against the entire concept of detection. Built by Lockheed's Skunk Works under the command of Ben Rich, the Nighthawk was the culmination of a radical idea that survival didn't come from speed, altitude, or firepower. It came from being invisible. Its design was unlike anything that had ever flown. Angular, alien, engineered not for aerodynamics, but for reflection angles. Every edge, every panel, every intake was tuned to redirect radar away from its source. It didn't glide it deflected. It didn't announce it disappeared. But stealth wasn't a shape. It was a system. The Americans built the F-117 not just to fly unseen, but to operate autonomously in denied airspace, to strike targets deep within the heart of hostile territory, and to return home without detection, let alone interception. No radar, no afterburners, no speed advantage, just complete control over how and if it was ever seen. It carried just 2 bombs, no guns, no dogfighting capability, no defensive armament, because it didn't need them. Its defense was absence. Its weapon was precision. It didn't need to survive a missile. It just needed to never be locked on in the first place. The F-117 flew only at night, always alone, supported by a vast American infrastructure of AWACS, satellite imaging, refueling tankers, and GPS-guided planning. Every mission was pre-plotted down to the second waypoints, altitudes, turn angles, all designed to thread the needle between Soviet radar cones. It didn't attack the Soviet system. It bypassed it. This wasn't brute force. This was surgical presence. It proved that the battlefield was no longer about overwhelming the enemy. It was about controlling their awareness. And it worked. The F-117 flew over Panama in 1989 undetected, over Baghdad in 1991 undetected. It took out command centers, radar installations, communication hubs before conventional aircraft even crossed the border, while Soviet doctrine focused on more radars, more missiles, more interceptors. The Americans focused on being unseeable. And every time the F-117 crossed a border and returned untouched, it proved something devastating. The most expensive, sophisticated air defense system in the world could be rendered obsolete by geometry and silence. This was the true American system, not just stealth aircraft, but a military built to exploit what the enemy refused to believe. It happened without warning. March 24, 1999, Serbia, Operation Allied Force, at 8:15 p.m. local time, the air defense net along the Yugoslav-Hungarian border lit up, not with radar contacts, but with confusion. Reports trickled in explosions in Belgrade. A command bunker struck, a telecommunications node disabled, a Ministry of Defense compound in flames, but no aircraft had been seen. Not on radar, not by lookouts, not even by infrared. For the Soviet-trained officers embedded in Serbia's integrated air defense system, it was déjà vu. The same absence, the same fear, back in Moscow, watching from afar. Soviet air defense veterans stared at satellite feeds in disbelief. It was happening again. The F-117 had struck, and once again, no one saw it coming. The Nighthawk had flown through a dense, multi-band radar grid. Soviet-era P-18s, P-12s, S-125 missile systems, all activated, all blind. Searchlights scanned empty skies. Interceptors scrambled toward nothing. By the time the F-117s had dropped their laser-guided bombs and exited, Serbia's capital was burning, and the entire defense net was still asking one question. Where did they come from? It wasn't the first time. During Operation Desert Storm in 1991, 42 F-117s flew over 1-200 sorties into the heart of Saddam Hussein's air defenses guided by Soviet-trained radar crews. 0 were shot down. 0 even took damage. Baghdad, bristling with radar and SAMs, became a training ground for stealth operations. The humiliation was absolute. Soviet-designed S-75s, S-125s, and even the vaunted ZSU-23-4 Shilka failed to so much as detect the intruders. Each Nighthawk that crossed the radar curtain was a message: your system is outdated, your doctrine is broken, your skies belong to us. One Soviet colonel, reviewing post-strike data from Iraq, wrote bitterly in his report, "Our weapons were designed for threats we could see. These do not exist within our spectrum." But the true humiliation wasn't in the missiles that missed. It was in the missiles never fired, because no target was ever seen. Even when Serbia managed to down a single F-117 using sheer luck and visual spotting, it was too late. The message had already been written in steel and silence. Stealth had not just entered the battlefield, it had erased the opponent's ability to participate. This was not combat, it was asymmetric annihilation. By the dawn of the 21st century, the Soviet air defense system, once the most complex and feared in the world, was no longer feared. It was pitied, not because its missiles couldn't fly, but because they were flying blind. The F-117 proved that power no longer came from scale or saturation, it came from denial, from controlling the engagement before the engagement began, from shaping the battlefield not with fire, but with absence. For the Soviet system, built on 5 decades of radar-centric doctrine, this was existential. Their strategy had always been simple: detect, target, destroy. But if the first step failed, if detection was no longer guaranteed, then everything else collapsed. Every SAM battery, every MiG on alert, every watchtower, every doctrine manual, every kilometer of overlapping radar coverage, all of it became irrelevant. This wasn't just military defeat. It was ideological collapse, because the Soviet military identity was rooted in technical dominance. In being the world's best at layered, redundant control, they had failed in economics, failed in politics, But the one thing they always believed they could defend was the sky. And now, they couldn't. The F-117 didn't just bypass their systems, it mocked them. It forced a reckoning. Across Russian defense circles in the 1990s, analysts rewrote entire volumes of air defense doctrine. Radar specialists were forced to admit that the electromagnetic spectrum was no longer sovereign. Funding was redirected from missile brigades to low-frequency, over-the-horizon radar arrays. The pursuit of infrared search and track systems intensified, but it was all reactive. The Americans had already moved on. By the time the Soviets admitted stealth was real, the U.S. was already testing the B-2 Spirit, fielding the F-22 Raptor, and designing platforms that would never even show up on infrared. The game had changed. The rules were rewritten, and Moscow hadn't been invited to the table. They had lost the most important war of the Cold War, the war over what was visible and what wasn't. And unlike ideology, stealth wasn't something that could be debated or denied. It simply worked. And the more it worked, the more obvious the truth became. You can't shoot what you can't see. And if you can't see it, you've already lost. The F-117 never roared. It never shattered windows with sonic booms or dominated air shows with aerial displays. It simply appeared, struck, vanished. Its silence was its legacy. In museums today, the Nighthawk looks like a relic from another world, more spacecraft than fighter jet. Children walk past it, unaware that this black triangle once terrified radar operators across half the globe. But for those who stood behind Soviet consoles, watching empty screens while command centers burned, it was more than a machine. It was a phantom. A new kind of warfare had arrived, one that didn't require overwhelming firepower, but precision, secrecy, and geometry. The F-117 forced generals to confront the limits of their vision. It proved that the most advanced systems, the most layered doctrines, the most disciplined commands meant nothing if they couldn't detect the threat. And it did this without a single dogfight, without needing to win in the air, because the battle had already been decided when the F-117 wasn't seen. Today, stealth is no longer a novelty. It is the baseline, a requirement. Every serious air power now chases it. But it began with one impossible shape, one radical idea, one aircraft that rewrote the rules of engagement. The Cold War ended with treaties and collapsed economies. But in the shadows, it also ended with the realization that some wars are won not through confrontation, but through invisibility. The Nighthawk was never meant to dominate the sky. It was meant to make the enemy question if the sky still belonged to them at all.